If you've stumbled across this video, it's probably not the first one you've seen claiming it will help you get better at War Thunder Ground RB, but this one is going to be a little bit different from what you're used to. Instead of just showing you some settings, pointing out overpowered camping spots, or other more surface level points like that, in this video we're going to get to the root of the more fundamental reasons why you aren't doing well. And to do that, I'm going to show you every single strategy, optimization, and dirty trick I've learned from no-life grinding this game for the better part of a decade. If you follow these actionable tips I share here, I can guarantee you will be able to noticeably improve your performance on any map with any vehicle at any battle rating. I know that might sound like quite a tall order, but I am extremely confident you will not be disappointed. Let's start off with the most important point first. I'm sure most of you are well aware of the importance of positioning, but what I see almost everyone get wrong is exactly what good positioning actually looks like in the context of War Thunder. To show you what I mean, let's start off with a little exercise. Here's an imaginary War Thunder map I've drawn up. Let's say the map is entirely flat with only these black boxes acting as obstacles which can't be traversed, destroyed, or shot through. Here I want you to pause the video and tell me, is there anywhere on this map you would identify as a particularly strong camping spot? If you said no, you might be correct if we were talking about some sort of run-and-gun first-person shooter game, but War Thunder definitely does not fall into that category. There is in fact a very strong spot here, but before I show you where, I'd like to explain the why first. If you're like me and have a background playing games like Call of Duty or Battlefield, you're probably holding on to a lot of unconscious biases which are causing you to fundamentally misunderstand how to use positioning to your advantage in War Thunder. This might seem like a bit of a weird tangent, but trust me, this is important. In most first-person shooter games, the direction an enemy is facing doesn't generally affect your damage output. A headshot is a headshot regardless if it comes from the front, the rear, or the sides. In War Thunder, though, it doesn't quite work like this. Many vehicles have far heavier frontal armor than side armor, and you may need to consciously aim for weak spots to even cause any damage from the front. Hitting an enemy from the side, on the other hand, is practically guaranteed to cripple, if not insta-kill your target. This means if you manage to get the drop on an enemy with your front armor facing their side, you possess an overwhelming advantage in that engagement, since you're both landing the first hit and are less at risk of actually taking damage than your opponent is. But as I'm sure you're all aware, it's much easier said than done to actually set up all of your engagements to play out this way. So I hear you asking, how can I reliably position myself to attack the enemy from the side? Well, this question can be answered once again by taking a look at this map. If I were playing on this map, I would immediately identify this spot as being by far the most advantageous position for me to head to at the start of the match. If you're confused about why this is such a strong spot, let me discuss a dynamic I like to call map flow. Basically, in any objective-based game mode, it's a reliable assumption that the majority of the enemy team is going to head either directly to the objective or go around the edge of the map in order to guard their team's flanks. Because we know A, the areas in which the enemy activity is going to be the heaviest, B, what direction the enemy is heading, and C, from what direction we need to engage the enemy from, that being the flank. On any given map, we can very easily figure out what the best locations and routes to engage the enemy are. What this looks like is, ideally, a spot which will provide us with at least concealment, if not hard cover, from the enemies heading out of their spawn, which gives us line of sight, side on the routes heading from the enemy spawn to the objective, which gives our allies easy line of sight to enemies that are trying to push on us, and which is located in a low traffic area of the map, generally between two objectives. Let me give you a few examples of what this sort of conscious positioning looks like in practice. This first example is on the single cap version of Maginot, where I've pulled off a pretty conservative flank. I haven't gone that far around the edge of the map, and I've parked myself behind this hill, which allows me to stay totally hidden from the enemies heading towards the objective. This spot gives me plenty of cover to hide behind if things start going south, and if the enemy does decide to push on me, they'll have to expose themselves to retaliatory fire by my teammates in order to do so. The point I'm trying to make here with all this is that you don't need to go around memorizing individual spots on every map, or especially rely on getting one map or another with an overpowered spot in order to do well. If you keep these considerations in mind, I promise you'll start finding these sorts of spots all over the place, all on your own, which is very useful considering how often Gaijin goes and changes around their maps. This doesn't mean you should always just sit back and camp, though. Usually, the main point of spots like this is to break up the enemy's initial push towards the capture points. Once you're confident the enemy's numbers have been worn down, you can start pushing up, picking them off one by one, and lock them even further back into their spawns. This 14-kill failed nuke in the Panther II is a good example of staying mobile and applying this strategy to a whole region of the map rather than just one spot. Take a look at where I'm moving over the course of this match. The reason I'm able to get so many kills in this match is that the enemy team is so focused on the capture points that they're not paying any attention to this dead space here between A and B, which allows me to just skulk around, driving from spot to spot, picking off targets of opportunity. Do also notice that I'm consistently keeping cover between me and the enemy spawn. And speaking of not camping, try not to spawn camp, not only for the obvious reason of it just being annoying, but also because of spawn protection, you give the enemy team a very easy opportunity to kill you while they're invincible. I've seen plenty of teams choke easily winnable matches by all rushing the enemy spawn, getting killed by spawn protected enemies, and then leaving the cap points vulnerable for the enemy to rush out and capture. It's much better to just wait outside instead. Also, something you may notice me doing in the background is not immediately capturing points controlled by the enemy. A psychological trick you can pull off on people is leaving enemy caps or even enemy units alone so that enemies heading out of their spawn will keep their guard down and assume everything between them and that cap or unit is a safe area. Just remember, War Thunder might offer respawns, but everyone still gets a limited number of spawn tickets. Killing and disrupting the enemy team early in the game is going to hamper their ability to hang in the fight as long as your team will, and quite frankly, by ambushing people like this early in the match, you may be able to get some of them to just rage quit. The most important point I want you to take away from all of this is that, as a general rule, if you're frontally engaging targets who are already aware of your presence, you are already doing it wrong. Pushing up behind the main combat area to wear down the enemy front line and disrupt their reinforcements is almost always how to be most effective, unless you're using some sort of tank destroyer with an insane amount of penetration or something. That being said, let's say that by some fluke though, you're quickly killed without making much of an impact on the match. Well, don't worry, because your fight isn't over even if this strategy fails. Let's talk about how I go about staying in the match as long as possible and earning myself a significant boost to research points and SL. Now, here's an unfortunate truth many of you will not want to hear. You are never going to reach the point where you become so good at the game that you're getting nukes every other match or getting crazy high kill games every single time. Unless, of course, you decide to exclusively beat up on reserve players. However, you can very easily reach the point where you consistently maintain both a positive KD and win rate, and by far the easiest way to do this is to center your grind around lineups. If you do this like I show you, it will make the game far more fun, speed up your grind, increase your win rate, and generally just make the game a whole lot more interesting. Obviously, one death leaving lowers the chance of your team winning the match because you have one less person helping them, but it also means you're less likely to receive the SL and RP bonuses which come from winning the match, and also means you won't get the chance to receive a skill bonus, a further RP reward multiplier earned by getting a certain number of kills. Also, I can tell you from experience, it's generally a lot more fun to actually fight the enemy team for the W than desperately chase lucky matches where you happen to get a ton of kills. First, let me show you what, in my opinion, an ideal lineup actually looks like. Keep in mind, you won't always have access to every category of these vehicles, especially if you're playing a smaller tech tree. This is just to give you a general idea of what you should be keeping an eye out for. You may also have more than one in each category, which is also fine. Your lineup should center around what I call your first spawn vehicle. This should be a vehicle with relatively good survivability, firepower, and mobility, which is capable of holding its own in a wide variety of situations. This will usually be a medium tank, a heavy tank, or an MBT. Next, you should have your second spawn. What exact type of vehicle falls into this category varies a lot depending on the battle rating, but sometimes it may even be identical to your first spawn. Generally, you want this to be a vehicle mobile enough to help you return to the engagement area quickly. Its armament should allow it to engage light, heavy, and ideally airborne targets with some degree of effectiveness. A few examples of decent second spawns would be mobile medium tanks or MBTs with a high rate of fire and roof-mounted 50 cals, or IFVs with both autocannons and anti-tank missiles. Then you have your third spawn. This will usually be an SPAA, but ideally you want it to also be able to engage light ground targets, or at the very least have an autocannon powerful enough to shoot out enemy tracks, as well as being mobile enough to rush enemy cap points with a limited amount of time left on the clock. This is the vehicle you'll want to use if the match is down to the wire and when most of the enemy team is either in CAS or SPAAs. Remember, destroying CAS counts towards your skill bonus, and SPAAs are very cheap compared to the expensive CAS aircraft they're destroying, so in my opinion it definitely pays to bring SPAAs along whenever possible. Then there are tank destroyers and light tanks. I wouldn't exactly call these vehicles necessary, but they can be very helpful on certain maps. Generally speaking, tank destroyers tend to be good at holding down lines of sight where you know there will be large numbers of enemies heading directly at you. This is especially true if you have a tank destroyer capable of what the kids call lol penning most enemy vehicles. That is to say, they have such overwhelmingly powerful main guns that they can easily overpower the armor of most vehicles they face. The Su-100Y, the Stura Emil, and the PTZ-89 are some examples of these sorts of vehicles. With light tanks, you can theoretically use them on any map, but my main use for these vehicles is to make my lineups more up-tier proof. Whereas a medium tank or an MBT will typically be badly outmatched when faced with its equivalents in a full up tier, scouting doesn't magically get less effective in an up tier. For this reason, whenever possible, I tend to run light tanks when faced with an up tier, and focus on scouting, then running SPAA or CAS depending on what the situation calls for. And speaking of CAS, let's lastly talk about aircraft. I know most of you absolutely hate CAS, but as long as it's a game mechanic, it's kinda my job to at least touch on it. My first piece of advice, though, if possible, bring a fighter in your lineup. Fighters are often going to be the best method to counter enemy CAS spam, and ground RB can actually be a fun place to spade your aircraft rather than dealing with having to play stock and air RB. You ideally want something with at least some air-to-ground capabilities, but that isn't totally necessary. In my experience, the best sorts of aircraft for countering CAS are those which possess good maneuverability, good low-speed handling, and have powerful offensive armament, such as the Zero, the Spitfire, or the Yak-3, just to name a few. As for bombers and attackers, your best option is going to vary heavily depending on the battle rating, but the consistent trait you want to look for is the ability to engage ground targets from a standoff distance. For example, at lower BRs, something with a giant bomb like the PE-8 can just lob it in the enemy's general direction and immediately turn tail and disengage. There are also, of course, things like rockets, heavy autocannons, and bomb CCIP, which will allow you to sort of shoot and scoot after launching your ordnance, which is very important since flying in a straight line at low altitude will make you an easy target for SPAA. For higher tiers, something with fire and forget weapons like Mavericks will be able to engage from quite a distance and then go defensive against enemy SAMs. Being an agile and speedy airframe will further help your survivability. Some bombers and attackers, such as the IL-10, the Skyraider family, or the B-7A for example, also have pretty strong secondary air-to-air capabilities, which you can utilize once your air-to-ground ordnance is expended, but again, that isn't totally necessary to have. I'd like to wrap up this section by going over a few examples of particularly strong lineups which fit the criteria I talked about here. I will include premiums and event vehicles since this is a hypothetical exercise anyways. First off is America 11.7, and yes, I know this BR is absolutely saturated with premium noobs, but the vehicles themselves are quite strong. You have 4 11.7 Abrams variants, which are outstanding vehicles for their battle rating with firepower which is actually superior to many 12.0 vehicles, plus decent mobility and protection. And to back it up, you have 2 light tanks with secondary anti-air capability, the ADATs, which is a great example of the third spawn type of vehicle I mentioned earlier, plus some attackers with decent standoff weapons. Next up is a personal favorite of mine, which is Germany 5.7. In this lineup you can carry up to 5.7 Tigers. I know a lot of you are probably used to encountering those vehicles being driven by brain-dead noobs, but I'm sitting at around 800 kills to 200 deaths in this thing, so absolutely do not underestimate them. You also have 4 different tank destroyers, which are all great in different niche situations, 2 Ostwind 2s, which are amazing third spawn vehicles, as well as some great options for aircraft. Lastly, I'll mention Russia 10.3. This lineup has 4 different T-80 and T-72 variants you can bring out, which are all quite versatile and work very well as both first and second spawns. Then you have 2 infamously annoying vehicles in the forms of the BMP-2M and the 2S-38, which can shred both ground vehicles and aircraft alike. You also get 2 different dedicated SPAAs, as well as the Su-25, which, even with dumb ordnance only, is a fantastic ground pounder. There are also some MiGs you could bring out as interceptors, but the SPAAs will probably work better. I hope this has been informative as to how I optimize my lineups and overall match strategy, but now I'd like to move on to probably the single most important piece of optimization there is to directly make these vehicles more effective, and that's your sights. If you are currently using the default sight in War Thunder,
it's time to stop, okay? No more!
The default sight is absolute garbage, especially for high-tier vehicles with dart rounds due to how visually obstructive it is, whereas the custom sights you have available will be able to give you a much clearer sight picture as well as some other advantages. If you aren't familiar with this system, this can be done by going to Options, Ground Vehicle Battle Settings, and Sight Settings. And real quick while you're in this menu, make sure the grass and tank sight is off, block vertical aiming while braking is on, and increase hit indicator fade time is cranked up higher than the default. I personally run 8 seconds. While you can probably guess what those first 2 settings do, increased hit indicator fade time will keep the directional hit marker on screen for longer. I find this helpful when I get shot by someone I can't see and need a few seconds to locate them. Anyways, once you get into the site menu, keep in mind the changes you make will only affect the vehicle you had selected in the hangar when you went into the menu, though you can change this in the menu on the top left, which is called Change Spectator for some reason. Obviously, doing this for every individual vehicle would be ridiculously time-consuming, so instead, once you get this thing to a place you like, you can save it as a preset, which you can then activate on any other vehicle. Aside from changing the default reticle to another one, I also like to change the reticle color to green, which is much higher contrast and easier to see than the default black. And I also set the backlight to red, which I prefer over the green for snow and desert maps. I'm not sure what the default keybind for backlight is, but basically it's the control that will allow you to switch between these two colors. A few other settings I like to have activated are turret, gun ready, and bullet type. These will show you the orientation of your turret relative to the hull, how many seconds are left on your reload, and what type of shell you have loaded, respectively. Not game-changing or anything, but it's nice to have that information easily at hand. Now, this is great and all, but if you want to take things even further, there is a way to make your sights fully customizable. This will allow you to use sights with even higher levels of practical functionality, such as built-in rangefinders, historical sights, or sights just simply meant to be morale boosters. Just a bit of background, before the update Dance of Dragons, the custom sight system was entirely different from what we have now, and would allow you to add user-generated custom sights directly into the game files, either to individual vehicles or to the All Tanks folder, which, as the name implies, would make them available to all ground vehicles. You can mainly find these sites at live.warthunder.com, by the way. This was rather annoying to those of us who rather liked the custom sight system we had been using. At the time, I decided to experiment with some workarounds, and sorry for the shameless self-promotion, but I became the first person in the community to discover there was in fact a way to revert custom sites functionality back to the way it worked previously. I already have an old video of mine which contains a full tutorial for setting this up, but the short version is that if you only started playing this game more recently and don't have a user sites folder in the game files, all you have to do is create one and the functionality will still work. Within this user sites folder, if you then create an all tanks folder, the sites within that all tanks folder will then be visible in the reticle drop-down menu for all in-game vehicles. And if you want them available for only one vehicle, you can create an individual vehicle folder where the sites will only be visible to that individual vehicle, which is helpful with clutter if you're using a lot of these. To find the codes to use in these individual vehicle folders, you can either just go to that vehicle's wiki page, where it will be at the end of the URL, or you could just create a user skins folder, then move it into the user sites folder, then remove the template at the start of the generated file name, as well as remove the files within it. One particularly useful site which I get asked about a lot is the Luch Light site you see me using in the background, which basically allows you to figure out the distance of an enemy vehicle by comparing it to the size of this adjustable box around your reticle. This site has a few additional setup instructions, but again, all of that can be found in the full custom site tutorial I mentioned earlier, which I will link in the description. The last thing I'll go over in this section, which is technically site-related, are 3 very important controls that you need to set up and be using regularly: binoculars, rangefinder, and set target for squad. Making frequent use out of these settings is going to give you a huge advantage over people who don't. Binoculars allow you to peek out over cover while your vehicle itself remains safe. But what you may not realize is that you can actually use the rangefinder through the binoculars as well. This means that if you aren't pressed for time, it can be very helpful to find the range of an enemy vehicle before you pop out and fire at them. The set target for squad button, meanwhile, allows you to place a yellow pip on the map wherever you're pointing. Aside from its intended function of showing your squad mates the location of something, a very useful secondary function of this mechanic is to more precisely target your artillery. If you see an enemy some distance away and aren't exactly sure their precise map location, you can pip them with a target point before hitting that location with artillery, rather than just operating off of guesswork. While this is certainly nothing game-changing, I've found this tactic to come in handy rather often. For the last section of this video, I'd like to go over something for those of you who are willing to go to some really extreme lengths to boost your competitiveness, and that's how you can improve your performance through hardware. While it is unfortunate, the fact of the matter is that hardware can be essentially a pay-to-win feature in War Thunder. Some of the reasons for this might be obvious, such as higher FPS from a stronger computer, less lag due to better internet, etc., but there are a few other hardware considerations I want to mention which you may not have thought of. The last one I'll be sharing is one which, to the best of my knowledge, nobody on this platform has discussed previously. So starting off with, a lot of people will talk about upgrading their PCs to get better in-game performance, But before you do that, you may want to take a closer look at your monitor instead. This is because if your PC is already exceeding the capabilities of your monitor, improving PC performance won't actually mean anything. The really important number you want to look for is refresh rate. A monitor with a 60 Hz refresh rate is only actually going to be able to display 60 frames per second. If your monitor isn't able to keep up with your PC's current specs, try upgrading this first before you drop a bunch of money on a new PC. Just as a personal example, I upgraded my setup earlier this year, and I went from a 32-inch 1080p monitor with a 60 Hz refresh rate, which I was running on a laptop which actually exceeded its maximum capabilities, to running a 32-inch 4K OLED monitor with a 155 Hz refresh rate and a PC which can make full use out of those specs. The visual difference between these two setups was like switching from regular sights to third-generation thermals. I can see so much detail on the 4K monitor that I can easily spot people from distances extreme enough that on a 1080p monitor they might have just been a few pixels. To show you what I mean, here's some footage of how easily I can hip fire on distant targets, which may not even be visible on the screen you're watching this. As a side note, a lot of people ask me about my graphics settings, since my footage probably looks a lot different from many of your games. This is largely a combination of the 4K combined with NVIDIA filters, my settings for which I'll leave up on screen so you can pause and copy them if you want. And on the topic of graphics, if you're looking for the best way to optimize your settings, Gladiator Gaming has a really good guide on them, which I'll link in the description. The only recommendation I would add on top of it is that, in my personal opinion, when your game is running in 1080p, TAA anti-aliasing with 4x SSAA looks noticeably better than any of the other options. Overall though, graphics are definitely something you should play around with on your own, since ultimately the quote-unquote best option is going to vary a lot depending both on your setup and your own personal preferences. Another piece of hardware which is extremely important for ground RB is headphones. A good set of headphones will not only allow you to hear the sound of nearby enemies from their engines, but even allow you to hear exactly from what direction they're coming. This will give you an enormous advantage in terms of situational awareness, and I use this all the time to set up ambushes on urban maps against enemies who clearly aren't using these themselves. You can further enhance this effect by turning up the volume of other players' engine noises and turning down your own in the sound menu. If you're playing ground RB with no sound or with loud music on, you're kinda handicapping yourself, especially if you're playing top tier where a lot of the most extreme tryhards hang out. And last up, as promised, let's talk about a secret weapon of mine, which a handful of my subscribers will know about, the side pad mouse. And before you ask, no, I'm not sponsored, nor am I recommending any specific model any of these should do. Anyways, the side pad mouse gives you access to an additional number pad where your thumb rests, giving you access to a huge number of potential keybinds you can run without taking your eyes off the screen or your hands off the other controls. On top of these 12 buttons, consider that you can also create separate controls when you hold down Shift, Cap Locks, Control, and Alt. So basically, you have an almost unlimited number of keybinds you can run with just your mouse hand. It's also particularly helpful for aircraft, since I can manage nearly all of my complex radar functions from here. For ground vehicles though, the biggest help is running my rangefinder, since I can maintain full mouse and keyboard control while activating it. Anyways guys, if you made it this far, then thank you. I know this was quite a bit longer than my norm. If you're new to my channel, most of my videos tend to center around individual vehicles, but with these subjects, I felt like a full, dedicated guide was needed. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out my merch store if you want to support the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.